G'day and welcome to Tuesday Night Live, the show where we ask all the big questions but don't take ourselves too seriously. My name is Andrew Sennett, and as always, I'm joined by my intrepid, intelligent and intergalactic co-host and conversation partner, Ryan Barcham. Hey Ryan, how's it going?
I'm good, thanks. Intergalactic?
Yeah, I had to go with something, and you're into those kind of weird pew 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 movies, aren't you?
I am. Star Wars is great.
Star Wars, that's right.
And that is an intergalactic
Right, yeah,
movie.
You're not a Trekkie.
Not a Trekkie.
You're a Wookiee.
Yeah, sure.
And speaking of in a galaxy far, far away, a long time ago, I'm wondering tonight, in honour of our special episode tonight on Story of My Life, who would you love to have dinner with? Someone who's perhaps not alive today, someone from history who you would love to have a meal with, and why?
You know, I think I'd like to sit down and have a meal with someone who, isn't known for being a villain or a hero, but somewhere in between, like an anti-hero or something like that. So I reckon someone like Ned Kelly.
Ned Kelly, interesting.
Really interesting to just sit down with and
be
like, who are you as a person?
The classic Australian anti-hero.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
So I reckon someone like that,
Yep.
I think would be really interesting just to figure out.
Yep.
But I'll ask you in a second. But before I do, if anyone is watching, let us know who you'd want to have a meal with.
Yeah.
But Senno, who would you want to sit down and have lunch with?
I think I'd probably go for Winston Churchill. He was a very, very interesting character. He lived an incredibly interesting life. He was one of the first paid speakers. He earned, the equivalent of millions of dollars for public speaking. So he was a renowned public speaker and gave some of the great speeches of the last 2 or 3 centuries. And he was just a really interesting person. He was determined from a young age to become a politician, and he said in order to do that, in order to be electable, he needed to be prominent, and to do that he went into the army and basically took incredible risks with his life. Incredible risks. He's the guy who said, there's nothing more exciting than to be shot at without result. You need to hear the zing of the bullet really close. And
yeah. What would you want to know about him? What questions would you ask?
Oh, so many things. I think about his view of life and the world. He had a very particular view of the place of England and the British Empire in the world. But also, I think what drove him in those years leading up to and through World War II. He used to say that his whole life had been set up to prepare him for that moment. And to that moment where he, took over the reins of the English government, and at the worst moment, and in the Battle of Britain, basically was what they looked at him as the saviour of Britain.
Yeah, right. Well, Andrew Powell would like to meet Martin Luther.
He'd certainly be an interesting guy, Martin Luther. He was a very interesting fella.
Yeah. It might be a bit hard to understand because I don't speak German.
Oh yeah, well, you're imagining a universal translator.
Of course.
You're in Star Trek now.
Yeah. Okay.
Universal translator.
Star Wars.
Well, in Star Wars, everyone speaks with an American accent, so it's okay.
So not true. We'll move on.
We won't talk about the racist
don't get me into
on
that.
Star Wars. Yeah,
let's move on
stay
before
away from that.
Things get heated.
Well, tonight we're doing a special edition of Tuesday Night Live that we call Story of My Life. And over the course of the year, we're going to do several episodes where we focus our attention on the story of someone from the ancient world and their experience of life and God. Now, what we often do with people from the ancient world, and in particular people we meet in the Bible, is to mythologise them. We turn them into objects of mystery and religious mysticism, and we forget that they were real people with normal lives, strengths and weaknesses, relationships, hopes and dreams, just like us. So tonight we're going to meet Mary, the mother of Jesus, and we're going to largely ignore all the religious stuff people think about her and the figure of worship she's become for many people, and meet her as a person. We're banking on the fact that real people are much more interesting than fake ones, and that you'll agree with us. But we'll see. Life's an adventure, right? Now, if you're watching on YouTube, please like, subscribe, bomb that notification bell, share, make a comment. All of that helps with the YouTube algorithm. And if you add the hashtag mailbag or just write mailbag somewhere in your sentence, we'll make it part of our conversation. If you're tuning in through the Facebook community, welcome back. So let's get into the show. So Ryan, what was your first introduction to Mary?
I think my first introduction was same as most people's. I think.
Yep.
Going to a Christmas Carol.
Yeah.
And seeing all the play or the story of Jesus' birth.
Singing the song about the little donkey on the dusty roads.
Yeah. And they're going to going to Bethlehem and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
That's definitely what I grew up with. I went to many different parks and they would play the same thing and it'd always be the same story.
Your first introduction to donkeys as well?
No, I watched Shrek as a youngin.
Okay, right. You got Shrek before Mary, you reckon?
Yeah, possibly. I can't remember how old I was. But I think so that, and then there'd be people in my family that would use Mary as a swear word. They'd say Jesus, Mary, and Joseph.
Yep.
But that's.
And then you had the band Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Is that a real band, Seno?
It so totally is, mate. But well before your time.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it's the thing, isn't it? Mary has 2,000 years of packaging she comes with. 2,000 years of people saying things about her. Now, we're not going to have story time with Amelia like we normally would tonight. Instead, we're going to meet a few people who we've asked to share their experience of Mary and what she means to them. Now, of course, all of the people you'll hear from are Christians, people of faith. That's because over the course of history, the majority of people who've bothered to get to know Mary have been Christian. So you'll hear the perspectives of faith from these people, but you'll also hear the connection of one person to another person. And that's what we're hoping that you'll see and perhaps connect to as well. What inspires them or motivates, moves them about Mary. How they identify with Mary's life, her joys and struggles, and her struggle to understand and live her life as someone who believed in God. We're hoping that in these moments you'll be able to see the woman through the years and feel a connection with her yourself. So to begin with, we're going to hear from Dan and get a basic picture of Mary.
I think probably the thing I've mostly learned from Mary, Jesus' mother, is the way that Jesus keeps overturning our expectations. You see right at the start, don't you? Mary is very unexpectedly pregnant. An angel comes and announces this to her. But then you see this as Jesus continues to grow up as well. When Jesus is 12 years old, she loses him at the temple in Jerusalem and then finds him in an unexpected place, and he gives an unexpected reason. Then maybe 20 years later, the next time we read about Mary and Jesus' brothers, they're coming to take hold of Jesus because they think he's lost his mind. He's surrounded by these crowds. He's not even taking the time to eat. And so they want to kind of take hold of him, control him, because they don't understand the way he's behaving is unexpected. But then again, we find Mary at Jesus' crucifixion. Who would have thought that the child that she was promised by the angel Gabriel would end up crucified outside the city of Jerusalem? But then finally, we see Mary as counted as one of the 120 disciples in the first chapter of the book of Acts. She becomes a follower of Jesus.
It is surprising how much we know about Mary, considering she never put herself forward or wrote about herself, isn't it? That we meet her quite a few times. We actually meet her before we meet her more famous son, Jesus.
Yeah, that's right. But a lot of what we learn is how she reacts or interacts with her son.
Well, of course, yes. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And it's interesting, we meet her quite young. She's an adolescent girl, really, quite young when she gets married. And we meet her as that young mother struggling with this child.
We hear about the story when she loses her son at the market.
Down the shops.
Yeah.
Everyone's done that.
Yeah.
Oh, man, who hasn't lost their kid? I remember those moments.
My mum likes to tell a story about how I got lost at Target.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, not quite the shops to the temple, but similar kind of story.
Yeah.
And then the Mary who's the mother of an adult and struggling with that relationship with him, the woman who stands at the cross, and then the woman who actually becomes a follower of Jesus. It's an interesting and incredible life story, this story of Mary.
Yeah, and it's a life, like Dan said, that of just twists and turns for it. Everything seems to be unexpected.
Yep.
Which, for me, feels like, if the mother of the Messiah, of Jesus, you'd think that her life would be pretty swell and pretty
smooth.
Straightforward. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was far from smooth. Now, we're not going to do narrator biography, though, tonight. Instead, there are a few things about Mary we noticed as we looked at her life and listened to her and listened to people who spoke about her, and we want to share those things with you. And the first thing we noticed about Mary was her personal courage. She's a woman of great courage.
To me, Mary isn't a silly, naive little girl. Even though she is very, seems to come across very innocent and trusting, she knows her God well. She knows His word, she knows His character, and she is courageous to trust Him and obey Him, even when she knows she could very well be alone, that Joseph could divorce her, that others are going to think that she's gone off and slept around. She was willing to risk her own life. She and Joseph flee with Jesus in the middle of the night when they're under threat. They have to move countries all of a sudden. That takes a lot of guts and courage to trust God's word about that and give up everything.
I think Mary is an extraordinary woman. And of course, I'm not the only person in history to think that. Here was this woman, actually, someone we might even call a young girl, an adolescent, probably would have been around the age of 13, where she was told by God that she would be the mother of the Messiah, the great king that God had appointed. She found out that this was going to happen before she was even married to Joseph. You probably know the story. That was fairly overwhelming and also scandalous, because her fiance, she was engaged, she was betrothed, had to come to terms with this. It's a unique event. It doesn't happen every day. In fact, it only happened once. And it was just a no-no in that culture to have a child out of wedlock. And how is she meant to explain this kind of miraculous thing? So that was the first kind of hurdle.
Mary shows me that God doesn't just use men to have significant roles in the Bible, but she also shows me that God even uses women to bring about His plans, and to also see that women can take such an important part in the growing of God's kingdom and serve our Lord Jesus.
3 words I would use to describe Mary: courageous, convicted, fierce.
Fierce. There you go.
Yeah. I always forget just how young Mary was when this stuff happens. I don't know if it's just because all the movies portray her as an adult. Yeah. But the idea that she's 13 or 14 years old.
Yeah, we gloss over that, don't we? That women married very much younger in those cultures. They were grown up younger.
Yeah. We talked about that last week, didn't we? But that's a year 7, year 8 kid. And this is what's happening to her at this point. Yeah.
But it's also a familiar story, isn't it? An unwed pregnant teenager is something. The movie Juno. It's stories and movies and people around us. You go to school and there's inevitably the person who gets pregnant unexpectedly at school, and I think we identify with that because it's a problem today, even as then. It's probably not as big a stigma. I think there's some cultures in the world where it's a really big problem. It's not as big a problem for us in our culture, but it's still
wouldn't view it as a wholly positive thing, though.
Well, I think in the Western world, the single biggest predictor of poverty in the West, in the rich West, is having a child out of wedlock.
Is that right?
Yeah, being a teenage pregnancy is pretty much the single biggest predictor that you live in poverty. So it's not good.
Yeah. And there's so many things for Mary that's just out in not only is this happening, that was out of her control.
Yeah, that's right. And it's completely out of control. It happened to her. It's not as if she made a mistake or she did a whoopsie or she did something naughty.
Yeah.
This just happened to her. And so that, her courage in dealing with that, I think, is a fairly strong point.
Because that's not the only thing that's out of her control. What Joseph decides to do and how how the village or wherever she grew up around her decides to treat her as.
Yeah, her life is in other people's hands. It's what decisions they make, how they respond to what's happened to her is also fairly important. And it means she's incredibly vulnerable.
I mean, I'd be scared as a 25-year-old, let alone a
Yeah.
13, 14-year-old.
And trusting who we would call God, the flying spaghetti monster people would say, but trusting a God to be in charge, to putting your trust in God in that moment would be a pretty big deal for her.
Yeah,
Just move on. So I think her strength of character to actually go, okay, I'm going to run with this.
Yeah, it's a massive decision to
Yeah.
make to actually commit to this idea.
Yeah.
And trust what God has told him.
And then in her life, I mean, I don't think it was mentioned, I think, by Rachel, but within 2 years, like she has this baby, within 2 years, she's still a teenager, still a relatively mid-teens teenager. Within 2 years, she's on the run and becomes a fugitive and a refugee in a foreign country. Yeah. She actually has to run for her life because the guy who's king, this guy named Herod, finds out that there's a child that all these promises have been made about, and he goes, well, we're not having that. And he just basically goes on a smash. He's going to kill every child under 2 years old.
Yeah, it's a massacre
in the town she comes from, and he massacres children. And she runs for her life, and so she actively knows that there are people who want to kill her and kill her son.
And that's the thing, right? Like I went to Cambodia for a bit over a month, and I experienced culture shock. I know there were people who didn't
staying at that big hotel.
Yeah,
it must have been terrible.
It was so hard. People, but people just did things differently. People spoke differently, but I could always go home.
Yes.
But Mary's someone who's experienced being a refugee. She's experienced being a fugitive, really.
Yeah.
Constantly thinking, is Herod going to find me or not?
Yeah.
I feel like that would be on her mind, and so it's interesting to think of her when I read her in the stories that she's in, as someone who's actually gone through these things. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, so I just look at her and think, at this stage of her life, you see someone who's had to make those very difficult decisions. She's dealt with fear. She's dealt with it with great character and courage. So, you got to wonder. She'd be wondering if things will ever be normal again. Like Sarah Connor running from the Terminator.
Yeah.
And we often I think of Mary as this key figure in Christian history. And so it might be surprising to find out that even this young mum wasn't always on board the Jesus train. Mary had her doubts about Jesus too. So if we could get the video about Mary's doubts.
She was there with Jesus even before he was born. She knew about him. She knew him more intimately probably than anyone. She wiped his bottom. She also doesn't entirely get it. So there's just different moments when she and Joseph are at the temple and Simeon, the prophet tells them some things about Jesus and what will happen. And they kind of don't quite understand. And then when Jesus is a boy and they go to the temple and he gets left behind, and then Mary comes and finds him, and Jesus says, I had to be at my father's house. And again, she doesn't quite understand and get it.
Mary knew Jesus as a baby, as an infant, as a teenager, and yet when she saw him teaching, she thought he was crazy, out of his mind.
Ryan, what do you reckon that does to the dynamic of a relationship when your kid is different, is special? I know you've got a son and he's kind of special to you, and I guess he's going to be a ranger, so that makes him special in some sense. You've got to prepare him for a life of suffering, of ranger jokes. I had a mate who, his term for rangers was filthy stinking blood nuts. So your kid's special to you, but what do you reckon it'd be like if your kid was truly special? If you had, there's kids with, who are disabled or on the spectrum, that sort of thing, but there are also kids who are, who are gifted.
Sports stars.
Yeah, sports stars or intellectually gifted. What do you reckon it'd be like to be a parent of a child like that?
In a lot of ways, I don't know. Hard.
Yeah.
I feel like the big thing with those is that I think similar to what Mary's like, it's hard to understand them.
Yep.
We were talking about being a refugee in Egypt, and just, the whole reason she's there is because of him.
Yeah.
And I feel like those kinds of things, like who is my son, would be playing in the back of her mind.
Yeah.
And so, I think when Mary's experiencing what Jesus is doing as a kid, and you just don't get, and she doesn't understand him.
Yeah. Well, pretty much from his conception onwards, people have been hinting at how difficult it's going to be his mum. And that question, who is my son? It'd be always in the back of her mind, and I can imagine. I can imagine you would be thinking, really, are those things really true? You know, what kind of person will he be? Surely he's just my son, isn't he? He's just my boy.
Yeah. And Michael's got a comment. I think it's based on what Rachel said, but Jesus washed away Mary's mess, but Mary wiped away Jesus' mess.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah. That's profound. Yeah.
But yeah, that's the thing, right? With Mary.
And he grew up, and it went just as you'd expect it to go. A tricky and hard to understand child, and there were those incidents in his childhood that people mentioned. You know, the time he got lost down at the shops, down in the temple, where it was difficult, and dealing was difficult. But that became a difficult relationship with him as a man when he grew up.
And it's funny because we as Christians we talk about Jesus being perfect.
Yeah.
And so in my brain, particularly with my son. Having the perfect child means sleeping through the night. But this is something.
Did he do a number 3?
Yeah. This is something very different, right? This is Jesus is. We would say Jesus is perfect, but who he is it must be, or it feels like it's clashing with what she thought he would be, or what she wants him to be.
Well, we don't know, do we? But certainly you can see that the family wants to take hold of him. A couple of our commenters mentioned that moment in their lives where she and his brothers came to kind of grab hold of him because they thought, there's something going wrong with him. Now, Mary's a religious woman. She said all sorts of things about him, but what does it really mean? What does all that really mean? So it's not surprising that a difficult relationship like that would end in grief or come to grief, and that's what we see. If you could have the next video.
And yet from the very beginning, and increasingly, as Jesus' work unfolds, it becomes clear that this is going to happen in a way that was a bit harder to take. He wasn't going to go straight to his throne in Jerusalem or something and have all these flowing robes and Mary could sort of hang around with the entourage or something. I'm the mother of the... It wasn't going to be like that. It wasn't going to be like an English royal wedding with teeth or something like... No. It wasn't going to be like that. This king was going to suffer first. In fact, this king was going to go to the most shameful and humiliating death that the Roman Empire could think up. Now, if you keep watching these videos, you'll hear more about that. But we're focusing on Mary and her struggle to come to terms with that. She trusted God. She sought to be obedient to him. She knew that his way was the best way. But this idea that he was going to die in this horrible way, that God's own people, instead of welcoming their king, that the world for whom this king held so much promise was going to reject this king, that was a tough one. I'm going to read you a poem now. You might like this. It's a short poem. If you're into poetry, you might find interesting. It was an ugly work. The lash bit deep. His mother saw her blood upon the wood. The gentle wind of God had touched her flesh, untouched by any man, to stir to life the sensitive cell, to give the boundless word a heart, to hold our human hurt, a hand, to feel the iron biting to the beam. Oh, Mary, you were very young to bear that burden so immense, that weight of God crammed in the brain and body of a boy, to take the sword of God into your soul. How joyfully the gentle Spirit sang into your tongue that perfect song, which I shall hear you sing and sing with you in heaven. The 3 words are these: fragile, forgiven, and faithful.
Poetry. How many of you are into poetry, I wonder?
I'd like to say I am, but I definitely struggle.
Yeah. I don't mind a bit of a poem every now and then. I think it's really evocative, that sort of thing, and that's why we kind of included it there, left it in. But I think also that this is a point where all of us can identify with Mary. All of us can actually stop and take stock and go, we are with her in this moment. I don't think anyone can stand and watch their child die, watch him killed unjustly, and be okay. The fact that it was an unjust killing just makes it all the worse, doesn't it? That she has no power. Once again, like in her early life, with her vulnerability, here she has no power. There's no recourse. There's no one she can appeal to. She just has to stand there and watch her son die. And this I guess would feel like her last moments with him. It would have just been profoundly awful.
Yeah, I can't imagine it, and I can imagine though it wouldn't help, if knowing that it was going to happen either.
No, well, I don't know that she really had much awareness of what was going to happen. Like, even the people who followed Jesus most closely didn't really understand what was going to happen here. That's true. And were not prepared for it.
But she has those things that she's heard, from the beginning.
Yeah.
That might have clued her in. Like, this is it, right? Like all those moments are beginning to be, everything that she's been trying to understand about Jesus, everything she was told is beginning to get tied up here.
Yes, yeah. So when he's 8 days old, she's told about a sword of grief piercing her soul. A sword will pierce your soul too, and you're going, you don't know what that means. And now she stands here and she begins to understand what that means, but in the most terrible and desperately awful way. And I think a lot of us can identify with her in her grief because we know that feeling. Here's where a whole lot of those confusing threads of her life come together. Yeah.
She was one of the two women that went to his tomb, wasn't she?
I think so. Yes.
There was two Marys, I think.
Yeah.
And if so,
there was a confusing number of Marys.
Yeah.
But
that's right. But that you can see that the fact that she's going there, as a probably, I imagine, like a part of what she had to do as a tradition, but part of that grieving would come with that, I imagine.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. And it would have driven that home, wouldn't it? I mean, we tend to, once we've gone through the funeral, it's over. But for her, that funeral was only the beginning. There was a process and more things they had to do with the body before it was all finished with. And so it kind of kept dragging on and dragging out. But I think as well, because she's heard these things before, because she's in a sense been prepared for it, all those threads are starting to come together. And perhaps those things that she was confused about with him, or those doubts that she had about him, are beginning to make more sense now. But it comes with this crushing and overwhelming grief. And so we want to move now to our fourth thing about Mary. So we've looked at Mary's courage, we've looked at her doubt, we looked at her grief, and now we want to look at Mary as a person of faith.
After Mary wasn't quite sure about Jesus when he was alive, after Jesus died and rose again, the Bible speaks of how Mary was with Jesus' closest followers right after he had gone into heaven. She goes back on her first read of Jesus because she sees that he actually is the Lord and Saviour. I can relate to Mary in that I can imagine she might be feeling a little bit sheepish, a little bit embarrassed that this one who she had doubted, this one who she thought was crazy, he had actually done what he said he was going to do, died for sin and risen again. So she might feel a little bit of embarrassment when looking back on what she previously thought of Jesus when she sees that Jesus is legit. I can relate to Mary in that because I too feel a bit embarrassed when I look back on my previous rejection of Jesus. I can see that I judged him wrongly, and I'm so thankful that he can still show grace even when it takes me so long to figure out who he is. 3 words that I would use to describe Mary: devoted, determined, and in the end, humble.
So, Ryan, I think every parent of a young child thinks their child is special. But what happens when your child really is special? What happens when your child is someone truly great and you live to see your child become truly great?
That's the thing. Like this, like it reminds me of how does the mother of a king, how does she, what's the relationship with her son like?
Well, usually, at least in the royal family, it's kings bequeathing kings. But what happens when your son becomes the king of everyone? You know what I mean? Like it's what happens when your son just surpasses you so completely and profoundly? And this mostly happens with ordinary people whose kids become Olympic champions or movie stars, and I came from humble roots and all that sort of thing. But what happens when your child just completely transcends you, goes beyond you?
Yeah, I don't know. Hey, it's one of those things where you want to still be the parent, you still want to be the mum or the dad.
Yeah.
But they're at this point they're an adult now.
Yeah, but at some point you become part of the entourage. You're not simply mum or dad anymore, or brother or sister. You're now part of the following, aren't you? If you're going to acknowledge what they've become.
Yep.
And I think that's just on steroids with Jesus. Because Jesus has done what he said he was going to do. He didn't just die for people, he rose from the dead. And that, that says now he has become now an object of faith, not just my child. And so Mary becomes this witness of his resurrection from the dead. She becomes a person of faith, a follower of Jesus.
Yeah, and I find it so fascinating that it's at this point that she becomes a follower.
Yeah.
Like we were mentioning before about her doubts and stuff.
Yeah.
But it's taken her, 30 plus years of Jesus' life for her to, it seems like, to finally figure it out.
Yes, and we don't know how sudden that was or what sort of process she went through, but certainly, yes, it's this is the big moment, isn't it? That moment where she, and I guess there's an amazing, it would be an incredible thing for her to have her son back from the dead, but she doesn't have her son back from the dead, she has her Lord back from the dead. And so what would it be like to go from a mother to a worshipper? Because that's what these Christians did. They weren't just, we're a bunch of mates now with Jesus eating fish and chips and a few beers. We're worshippers of Jesus eating fish and chips and a few beers.
I can't like I'm thinking of my own son, like the idea that one day I would bow down to him is very weird.
It feels wrong, doesn't it?
It feels uncomfortable.
The son always bows down to the father. That's the principle of life, isn't it? So for her, this would have been a profound moment. And I wonder for us, there might be a connection there for us, because that change from treating Jesus as just some guy, even if he's some special kind of guy, to treating him as God come for us, God come to save us, that would be, well, that's dramatic for us, isn't it? And in Mary, we see a model of that in a way. Yeah. And so the last video we're going to come to, the last one we want to talk about is Mary and us. So let's cue up the last video.
A big reason to me why we should connect with Mary is how important she is as a witness to Jesus's life and ministry. I mean, she was there with Jesus even before he was born. She knew about him. She knew him more intimately probably than anyone. She wiped his bottom. She obviously believes all that her son has said about himself. She believes that he is the promised saviour of the world, that he is Lord of all. And so after being there and seeing everything about Jesus, if anyone could spot a fake, it would be this woman. And yet she believes and trusts and follows Jesus. So Mary's really actually a very important witness to Jesus.
But Mary also shows us that it's never too late to turn back to Jesus. We don't need to be embarrassed of what we once thought about him. Instead, we can see him clearly and respond to him rightly without needing to be embarrassed that we thought the wrong stuff in the past.
Mary teaches us that no one has insider access to Jesus. Your family connections, they don't mean that you know automatically everything that Jesus is on about. You need to accept him for who he is and what he has to say for himself in all the strangeness in all the scariness, in even all the horror, as well as the beauty of who Jesus is.
So Mary is humble, she is submissive, and she is faithful.
Well, how do you connect with Mary? What do you learn from her? How does she inspire you or connect with you? What might she have to teach you? Are you on a similar journey from familiarity through doubt to faith? It's very interesting to see these different people's reflections on Mary as a person. What did you make of Rachel's idea, Ryan?
Yeah, it's coming back to what we said before, that like if there's someone who would be able to tell you whether or not someone's legit or not, it'd be their mum.
The woman who wiped his bum.
Yeah.
Would you think would be able to say?
She'd be the first one to tell you, no, he's not sinless.
Yeah. For instance, yes.
Yes, as one of the things. But yeah, in terms of who he is or what he's done, you know, you would feel that she knows him, or one of the best people to know who would say that they know him. Yeah,
and here's someone who was that intimately close to him for much of his life, and who saw him in one way and now sees him in this way. And so that's a fairly significant thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and to be willing to, you know, get past that uncomfortableness of bowing to your child. The fact that she's done that and she did that is a really large and important testimony.
Yeah, and so if you're someone who, you know, you have your doubts about Jesus, and we get that, I think a lot of people do have their doubts about Jesus and about faith, Mary's someone to actually take a look at and to think about and to consider. Consider her and her life, but also the testimony she has about her son. Yeah.
Yeah. But then there's also what Marley said. What did you think about that?
Well, I thought it was great because I've been there and done that. You know, I had to kind of basically kind of humble myself, fess up and go, yeah, I had Jesus wrong. And the fact that, and what Mary shows us is that that's okay. You don't need to be embarrassed to turn around. And it's an incredibly, it's an incredible thing about God, that God doesn't necessarily, he doesn't just condemn you with your first thought. You have this opportunity to actually turn around, to see Jesus for who he really is, and that's okay. You know, it's it's a wonderful truth that we don't have to get it right straight away. We look at cancel culture today. One thing you said as a high schooler in jest that might have been dumb, might have even been wrong, but you don't think that anymore. But you go back to that one thing that you said that was on social media now, and you're completely cancelled because of it, even though you no longer believe that or think that. You might be embarrassed by what you said, but it doesn't matter. You're still cancelled. But God's not like that.
No.
You come to God now and you repent. You turn around. And you say, no, I trust in Jesus, and God goes, well, that's great, you're forgiven. It's it's all good. And Mary shows us that, doesn't she? Because she becomes a worshipper of Jesus. I think that is really incredible. Yeah.
But I think I like particularly what Dan said.
Yeah.
That idea that, like, you know, if Jesus' mother couldn't really tell who he was growing up, then why should I think that? No one has, as he said, no one has insider knowledge.
Yep.
Or is on the inside to who Jesus is.
Yep.
Which, it makes me feel like, or I think about when, as I was figuring out Christianity for myself.
Yep.
Yeah, that idea, like I grew up in a Christian family, but did I really know who Jesus was?
Yeah.
Until some moments. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that idea of it's the kind of, this is the where I guess Jesus' faith Christianity is the most egalitarian, isn't it? That everyone has an equal chance, that there's no one with an inside track, no one with special things. So we tend to think there's special religious people who have a special inside line with God, but no, nobody does. Everybody comes to Jesus in the same way and on the same basis. All of us need to deal with Jesus as he is, and that's incredibly good. What a great thing to have. That everybody has the same access to God and the same ability to come to God, no matter who they are, where they're from, their background, what they've done.
Yeah, and I think all of this, I think it's just been great for me on a personal level to really humanise Mary and see her as an actual person.
Yep.
But I think we're gonna stop there. We're gonna have a break now. There have been quite a few questions coming in. We're going to get to them in just a second. But for now, we're going to have our quick toilet break segment. And I believe tonight we're looking at Bogota. Is that what it is, Senator?
Bogota, whatever, how you pronounce
by night. And so let's run that. All right, welcome back, everyone. The first question I'm going to ask is going to be my question. So, what does your shirt say?
Oh, sorry, yeah. My life is based on a true story. I thought it fitted with the theme of story of my life.
Right. I hope your life is based on a true story.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes it feels like I'm making it up, some of the things that happen to me. But based on a true story.
All right, let's get into it. The first question that we've got, if we can get that up, is from Ellie, who asks, do you think it would have been hard for Mary to follow Jesus, like to submit to him, seeing as though he raised him and knew him when he was a helpless little bug?
Yeah, good question, Ellie. I think it probably would have been, but I think it's hard for everybody to follow Jesus. It would have just been hard for Mary in some unique ways. It would have been hard for Jesus' brothers. Can you imagine being his brothers? And but one of his brothers becomes a leader of the church in those early years. So yeah, I think it would have been hard for Mary in some unique ways, but in a sense, it's hard for everybody. It's almost impossible for everybody. So, yeah. Yeah,
right.
Yeah. I don't know if you've got any special insight into that one.
Yeah, I feel like we've talked a little bit about like those things where she just doesn't understand fully.
Yeah. But his disciples are the same. They don't get it.
And that's the thing. And so yes, in that sense, it would have been hard to talk to anyone who you don't really get.
Yeah.
We'll go to the next question.
Sure.
This is from Ben, who asks, do you think Mary struggled with humility knowing she gave birth to the living Son of God?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. We don't really know. I think that process, though, for Mary of going through her doubt and her grief and coming to faith at the end probably means she wasn't all that proud of herself. Because she still had to see herself as somebody who had to come and bow down to Jesus at the end and acknowledge that he is Lord, that he's a risen King.
And I think I imagine to some degree it's hard to be proud, when she's gone through a lot of turmoil. As she's being a refugee, I don't think there's much room for pride in there.
She strikes me as a fairly humble person. We didn't really look at that aspect of her character, but she does strike me in many ways as a fairly humble character. She doesn't have a lot of pride. She doesn't push herself forward. Even at the end, she's there and people mention her being there, but she's not thrusting herself forward. She's there because she's his mother. And at the end, she's there because she's a worshipper and she's just with the others. But it doesn't, she's no more special than anybody else. And so I tend to think she probably isn't proud, which just says that her character, that's a great point about her character, isn't it? Because I feel like if it was me, I would be totally pumped,
Look at me bossing the...
I am the dad of the Messiah!
Yeah. I'm boss. I can tell him what to do.
Yeah, I'm the boss of you guys.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm the boss of the boss of you. So
Yes.
what does that make me? We'll keep moving for the sake of time. The next question is from Michael. Was Mary's job as a mother easier because Jesus never sinned?
No.
No.
I suggest not. I
mean,
think
there'd be some good stuff, right? Like Jesus
Yep.
never, there's nothing worse than when you, so at the moment, my son, when we go, and when he's going to touch something, he just looks at us and goes, Like, I feel like that's like, there's nothing more infuriating to me at the moment.
And I think this is the thing, he learned things too growing up. He learned and grew, and so that's a process for any child. So no, I don't think so. And you see that in her relationship with him. In the few moments that she relates to him as a child and as an adult, there's difficulties there, there's problems there, and it's hard for her. And so no, I don't think it was. And I think I don't think being a refugee was made easier because he was the son of God.
Yeah.
That sucked royally. It was really bad. And I think there were moments in her life that were really hard, and I don't think his death was easier. No. Because I think our experience of people, anyway.
Yeah. So I don't think it was easier.
No.
Maybe in some ways, but definitely not in others. Next question we've got. Jack asks, would Mary and Joseph have taught Jesus about God, like when he was a child? And all those would it have been useless considering that he is God? Yeah,
this is a really good question, Jack, and the answer is yes, of course they would. Where did Jesus learn about God? He learned it from his parents. Where did Jesus learn about God's word? He learned it from his family who taught him. They would have sent him to school. They would have sent him to religious school, to the religious Jewish school to learn the law. It's quite likely Jesus was trained as a rabbi. And so, yes, they would have taught him things, and he would have grown up learning things as a human. And so it's a good question because it points out the fact that just because Jesus was God doesn't mean he didn't embrace humanity and take on what humanity meant, including its limitations, which means humanity is something that we grow into. We learn as we grow up. They would have had, just like they would have had to teach him to talk and to walk, and, well, they didn't ride bikes back then, but the equivalent. They would have had to teach him games, and they would have had to teach him work. They would have sent him to school, and he would have learned, and they would have taught him things about God. They would have taught him their faith. So absolutely, yes. Yeah, and it reminded me of, I've just got it up here, at the end of Luke chapter 2. It actually says that Jesus grew. He grew, in wisdom and stature and knowledge and whatnot. Yeah. So he wasn't born with it all. And so he's not a magical baby. So this is the problem, I think. We often have these problems in thinking about Jesus and the fact that he's both fully God and fully human. And one of the problems we have is, well, if he's fully God, he must be like Thor, the Thor child. And so you get those weird kind of apocryphal stories of the boy doing miraculous things, that sort of thing. Well, that's not really what it's about. Ellie asks, I think she's joking, but she asks, do you reckon he was like, wow, this sounds familiar when he learnt things? No. But no, probably not. No, I think because he came and inhabited our humanity in such a way that he grew and learned like we were. He became like us in every way. And that means that he grew in knowledge in that way. Yeah. All right, we'll go to our very last question for tonight. And that is from the Brit from Oz. So in the end, did Jesus see his mother as another follower, or did he, being her son, still look up to her as his mother? That's a really good question. I don't know, really. It's another one of those things. How do you putting yourself in somebody's mind? So we don't really know. I imagine there was probably a bit of both. I imagine your mum is always special to you, and that even as he's risen from the dead, even as he becomes King and Lord of all, even as he's the Lord and King for everybody, and he's the friend of all sinners, if you like. I think there would have been perhaps a special place for him for his mum and a special feeling for his mum there. And so even though his mum needed to come to him as a worshipper, I don't know. I feel like it's just a feeling. I don't really know strongly about it.
Does the Bible describe John as the one that the disciple that Jesus loved the most? Is that?
Oh, your disciple Jesus loved, yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, no, not the most.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, I think I agree with you there. That he.
And he certainly set him to look after his mother when he's dying. You know, remember that moment when he's on the cross and he says, behold your son, behold your mother. And so I do think there is some feeling for her, but obviously he is the king for everyone. So it'd be some weird balance, I guess. Yeah. But really good question.
I think that's all we've got time for tonight. So Sano, take us away.
Yeah, so there were a couple of other questions, and we will try and get onto those at some point and get back to you. I know we've still got some questions from very much the earlier episodes that we still want to have a crack at. And so, hold faith with us. We will try and get some of those answered at some later point. But thank you. We're very glad you've joined us tonight for this special episode of Story of My Life. Please remember again to like, subscribe and click notifications and all that blah, blah, blah. It does actually make a difference. And keep the questions coming in and comments coming in. Have a great week, and we will see you next Tuesday night back to regular programming.